The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Locking Down and Equipment Safety webinar. I am Kim Mynard, the Senior Technical Officer at CIWM, and your host for today's webinar. I would like to point out that although your microphones are muted, you are still able to ask questions by typing these into the question box on the bottom of the grey dashboard on your screen. You are encouraged to do this at any point throughout the webinar, and your questions are not public. They can only be seen by the organisers. If you lose your grey dashboard at any point, there is a small orange arrow at the top left corner of the dashboard that will show and hide it. If you manage to minimise or lose the webinar presentation screen, click on the blue flower on the bottom of your taskbar at the bottom of the monitor to make it reappear. On your dashboard at the bottom of the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see there are some documents that the speakers may refer to in their presentations. If you click on these documents, they will open up in a separate window, and that's under the handouts grey banner there. If the session is being recorded, this session is being recorded, and a link to this will be shared with you via email as soon as possible. So don't worry about trying to take lots of notes, as you will be able to revisit the slides as well as hear the presentation at your leisure. Audience questions will be answered after each presentation during the webinar. This will give you the chance to type them into the question box as you think of them. But we ask that you submit typed questions throughout the presentation rather than waiting to the end, so that we can group the questions into relevant topics and avoid duplication. If we run out of time, we've had the chance to answer all of your questions. Answers will be emailed to you at a later date. Throughout the webinar, you'll be asked for your opinions in the form of questions and multiple choice polls. When a question comes up on the screen, you will have approximately 30 to 40 seconds to tick the answer you want to make and then click submit. If after this webinar anyone feels they need more detailed information on the webinar topic or other relevant subjects, we will be happy to provide further details, and the email addresses for everybody in this presentation are at the end. At the end of the webinar, we have a very brief multiple choice survey that will pop up when you log out. If you could take a couple of minutes to tell us what you think, your views are very important to us. Remember, this is an audience participation webinar, and your typed questions are very welcome throughout. I'm now going to hand you over to Geoff Smallwood, Health and Safety, Environment and Quality Director from Renewy, who will be speaking about the practical use of locking off plant at waste management sites. Geoff joined Renewy, formerly Shanks, in '93, following more than 10 years in the chemical and food and farming industries. In his current role, Geoff covers all of Renewy's operations in the UK, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, France, Luxembourg, Portugal, Hungary and Canada, heading up Renewy's safety, environmental, corporate, social responsibility and insurance functions. His background and main qualifications are in health and safety and environmental issues, although he also holds formal risk management qualifications. Geoff also sits on CIWM's Health and Safety Special Interest Group and the WISH Waste Industry Safety and Health Forum Steering Group, and is a corresponding member of ESA's Health and Safety Committee. Geoff has produced various formal health and safety guidance documents for the waste industry via his work on the WISH Forum. And of interest to this conference, Geoff wrote the WISH Lock-Off Information Sheet. So Geoff, you're a very busy man, so thank you very much for joining us today, and I'll pass you over now. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you. Subject of today's webinar is lock-off at waste management plants. John will join us later to give a legal view of life. I'm here to do the practical aspects. What I'll be covering is an overview of why lock-off is a critical control, the basics of what lock-off is, what it is not, and when to lock off, a quick run through some of the issues with lock-off, some of the misconceptions I've commonly come across with lock-off, and pieces on instructions, procedures and training, perhaps more importantly that, culture and enforcement, and then finishing off with the WISH information sheet on lock-off.
Thank you, Geoff, and we're going to be starting off with a quick question for the audience. So the first question for you all is what is the most common cause of worker fatal accidents in waste management? So do you think it's people being struck by a moving vehicle, or contact with moving machinery, or being struck by a moving or falling object? So if you could all cast your responses there. Okay then. And there we go, Geoff. You've got a bit of a split there between struck by a moving vehicle and contact with moving machinery. So what is the answer? Geoff, are you there?
Yes, to an extent, both those people who clicked on contact with moving machinery and struck by a moving vehicle are both correct. Over the past 15 years or so, the HSE has produced regular statistics updates on accidents in waste management. And until the latest one, which was released last month, struck by a moving vehicle, so that's pedestrian, has been struck by trucks and mobile plant, was the most common cause of fatalities. But this year, for the first time, contact with moving machinery has moved into the lead. So as of now, contact with moving machinery is the most common cause of fatalities in waste management. And the trend is still going up. We're not getting any better about this. When we look at wider industry results, 80% of serious and fatal machinery accidents are the direct result of a failure to lock off. Yeah, and that is reflected in the waste management industry. We're no different. The vast majority of our fatal accidents with machinery are simply a failure to lock off effectively. To put that in perspective, that's 13 fatal accidents in waste management in Britain over the past 5 years. So it's 13 fathers, wives, daughters and sons who didn't go home at the end of the day. So this is something we really need to get better at. Moving on to the next slide. First, a pretty straightforward question: what is lock-off? And this is quite simplistic. Lock-off means moving all power from machines so it cannot start, it cannot be operated. For the vast majority of recycling equipment, that means electrical power, but also hydraulic, air power and similar. And then securing, however, you've isolated that power so it cannot be returned until it's safe to do so. Now, for the vast majority of recycling machinery, balers, conveyor assemblies and so on, that means turning the equipment off at the main isolation switch and securing with a padlock so that it can't be turned back on again. That's quite basic. Yeah, it's not difficult lock off. What is not lock off is simply using a functional stop. So for example, pressing the off button on a control panel because the machine can be turned back on again easily. It is not using an emergency stop because the machine can be reset and turned back on again. It's not relying on interlocks. These are in control circuits, and I'll come back to that later in the presentation. They can and have failed, and they can also be bypassed. So you've got a rather horrific photograph there on the right-hand side of the slide, where someone has disconnected a tag interlock, and the red fluid is indeed blood from a fatal accident. It is also not placing a tag or notice on its own on the machine. Tags can be used as reinforcement, but obviously they're very easy to remove, so they shouldn't be used on their own. So quite a basic principle. Next is really when to lock off. So in essence, lock off must be used for any task where anybody exposes himself to a machinery safety zone, and that might be by removing a guard, entering a machine enclosure, or what they call residual risk. So for example, the feed chute to a baler, which is not practical to guard completely because the opening needs to be big enough to take cardboard boxes and similar. So anything which results in a person being exposed to a machinery safety danger zone must include lock-off. Typical examples, I'm sure you're all aware, cleaning and block clearance, maintenance, repair, and so on. So quite simply, anything that exposes someone to a machinery danger. Moving on to some issues with lock-off. Let's start with control circuits. Yeah, most machines, including recycling machinery, have a power circuit, which provides the power that makes the machine work, and they also have a control circuit. The control circuit is a lower voltage circuit. It's typically 24 volts. And on that control circuit are things like interlocks and emergency stops. Now, I would say at this point, interlocks includes Castell keys, exchange key systems. Some of you might be familiar with these. This is where there's a master key at a control panel, and you need to take the master key out to access slave keys in different parts of the machine to open guards, open machine enclosure gates, and so on. Yeah, there's a common misconception that these turn the power off direct. They do not. They are also in the control circuit. So if you look at the photograph on the bottom left, that shows a master exchange key, a Castell key, in a control panel. The door is partially open to show. And behind it, that key is not connected direct to the power. It's connected via a control circuit. Yeah. Now, control circuits come in different qualities, what's called safety performance levels. However, the vast majority of recycling equipment does not have high performance level control circuits, and they can and have failed. So using interlocks and e-stops instead of true lock-off is a recipe for it all going horribly wrong at some point. And with machinery safety accidents, the end result is normally not a bruise. Next is isolation switches. Obviously, you turn an isolation switch to off, and you can put a padlock through it. The first thing is that your workers need to know how that isolation switch works and where it is. Isolation switches come on in different designs, and they need to know how they work. Some of them have a tag that comes out. You put a padlock through them. Some of them have holes which line up. So don't assume that your workers know exactly how the isolation switch works. I did come across one occasion where workers were actually locking a machine on rather than locking it off. Secondly, isolation switches can fail. A lot of them are plastic lever on a square shaft, and the plastic lever can wear or it can break, and you may not notice that. So you think you've turned the machine off, but all that's happened is that the plastic lever has moved around one flat on the square shaft it's on, and the machine is still on. Quite a few machines in recycling also have local isolators as well as a main isolator. Beware, some of these are in control circuits, not in direct power circuits. Yeah, an easy way of looking at this, if you have a large trommel screen, for example, then if the isolator has wires running to it that are only 1 centimeter wide, then it's very unlikely that they're in the power circuit. Obviously, because the power circuit has some somewhat beefier wires than that. Yeah, so the same issues apply as would apply for interlocks and emergency stops, that there may well be in a power circuit. It may well be in a control circuit. Sorry. It's quite common with recycling equipment as well. It's added to. Someone installs a picking line and maybe an overband, and then at some point in the future, they decide to add a vibrating screen of some sort and so on. Yeah, and instead of joining up all of the power circuits, they end up with separate isolation switches for different parts of the machine assembly. I mean, ideally, there should be only one, but if you do have more than one isolation switch for your machinery, then obviously your workers need to know that, and they need to know what locks what off, and also what the interdependencies are. So if you're locking off a trommel screen, then you also need to ensure that the conveyors that go in and out of that trommel screen are also locked off. Yeah.
Okay, then thanks for that so far, Geoff. We've now got a question for the audience. So if 5 people are working on a machine, what is the minimum number of padlocks required? So is it 1, the supervisor has a padlock? Is it 2, 1 for the people working and 1 for the supervisor? Or 5, at least 1 for each person working? So I'll just give you a couple of seconds there to answer that question. Oh, that's quite surprising. The majority of people have said 5, Geoff. What do you make of that?
Well, The majority of people would be correct indeed, yeah. And this is quite a straightforward thing. Everybody working needs to have their own padlock. There have been some truly horrific accidents where only a supervisor's padlock, for example, has been applied. Typically, this is where maybe you have 5 people working on a machine. Everybody goes back to the control room after they've done whatever they're doing on the machine, and one person is missing. And someone might say, oh, they've gone for a coffee, or they didn't feel well and went home. So the supervisor's padlock has been removed and the machine restarted. Unfortunately, the missing person hasn't gone for a cup of coffee. They're still working on the machine. So one padlock for every person working is how it works. You can also place the supervisor's padlock. So in the example of 5 people working, 6 padlocks, 5 padlocks individually for each person working and 1 for a supervisor, yeah? But the minimum is 1 for each person working, yeah? Now to do that, most isolation switches will not take 5 or 6 padlocks. You need to use either a lock-off plate, and the top photograph left shows what's called a crab's claw lock-off plate, which allows you to place multiple padlocks. However, if you maybe got 10 people working, that becomes unwieldy. You end up with more than 1 crab's claw all cluttered around the isolation switch. And so an alternative is a lock-off box. This is where 1 padlock is placed through the isolation switch, and the key for that padlock is placed in a lock-off box. The box has holes around its lid, and then individual padlocks go through those holes to secure the lid of the lock-off box, so that all the padlocks need to be released before the box can be opened and the master key secured, yeah? So either way, whichever way you want to use these things, either a lock-off box or a lock-off plate, 1 padlock for every person working. Padlocks and keys. Let's be clear on this. Lock-off padlocks are for lock-off only. They should not be borrowed for security reasons or any other use. They are dedicated to lock-off. There should be no duplicate keys whatsoever. 1 padlock, 1 key. Any duplicates should either be kept secure or better, actually just destroy them. Padlocks are cheap, yeah, so no problem there. Obviously no combination locks or skeletons on master keys. Padlocks should be kept on a lock-off board. And this doesn't need to be an expensive thing. You can make them yourself. Simply, it's a way of keeping all the padlocks, lock-off plates and other equipment required all in one place, easily accessible by people who need to use them. Inevitably, during lock-off, somebody will lose a key at some point. Now, you can try and reduce the risk of this, for example, by putting very large key fobs on them, big coloured golf balls on chains on keys, which make them easier to find and harder to lose. When you do have someone who loses a key, you need to have extra special procedures in place. You must be 100% certain that all persons are accounted for. So, you know, excuses again like, oh, he's gone for a cup of coffee or he left site. No, you must make absolutely sure in person that everybody is accounted for before any padlock is forcibly removed. Obviously, lost keys must be replaced and lost padlocks replaced. You know, if there aren't keys or padlocks, then people can't lock off. And you need to make sure you've got sufficient padlocks, obviously. When people have placed their padlock and go working on a machine, they need to keep the key in a secure place, a zip pocket, for example, yeah? And keys must not be swapped. If work goes beyond 1 shift, then everybody must remove their padlocks and then the new shift must place their padlocks, yeah? So handing keys over between shifts is not on. Live working, these are tasks which cannot practically be carried out except when the machine is running. Now, typically in waste management, the most common one is tracking conveyor belts. The first thing you should do is try and engineer out the need for live working. So you can design guards at the end, runs of conveyors, which allow tracking to take place without the guard being removed. And there's an example shown in the picture top left. You can use slow running controls or inch controls. These only allow a machine to move a small amount or very slowly when live working is being done. Typical example in waste management would be replacing baler wire in an automated baler. Yeah. And the reasons to allow live working do not include operational convenience or cost or time. Yeah, you must be absolutely sure that there's no other practical way of doing it before you allow live working, and even then it must be only be done by competent people and under strict instructions. Yeah. Retained energy. Some machines, they may be powered by electricity, but they also have hydraulic pressure, for example, which needs to be depressurized. So you need to know whether your machine does that automatically when it's electrically isolated, or do you need to do it manually. You may have fast-moving parts, for example, fast-moving shredders, which need time to spin down. Potential energy, so gravity. So if you've got a vertical plane baler, can the baler packing face move under its own weight, in which case you need to prop it or lock it off with a scotch or similar. And there are some machines which can move when people are working in them, and the typical example is trommel screens, where work is clearing a block in a trommel screen. The trommel screen rolls round under their own weight. The obvious way of stopping that is at least one drive motor should be braked, or the placement of locking pins and similar. Instructions and procedures. You need to write down your lock-off procedure. The wish lock-off information sheet, which is included in the handouts, includes a list of what the components of your lock-off procedure should include, so you can use that to gap analysis with your own lock-off procedures. The one thing I will linger on is restart. This is critical. You know, when everything's locked off, you're all happy, is try and start the machine again. Yeah. Obviously, if it doesn't start, happy days, you've succeeded. But you'll be surprised how often everybody's locked off when they try and start the machine up and it does start. So a test restart is critical. Think about language when you're writing your lock-off procedures, appropriate to the audience, and use the photographs is good practice, obviously. And also you can place simplified versions, for example, at control panels or at machines to reinforce lock-off procedures, such as the one shown in the lower left photo. Training and induction. Obviously, once you've got a nice lock-off procedure, you need to train it out to all of your employees or relevant employees. Those will work under lock-off. It can be basic induction on the practicalities, but those who will supervise need to go through a full training regime. Yeah. And training must include a practical demonstration that you show them how to lock off, how the switch works and so on, and then they repeat it, they do it, so you're clear that they know exactly how to do it. And training should be obviously repeated periodically.
Thank you, Geoff. And now we have another question for the audience. Where a failure to lock off was the cause of an accident, what is the most common cause? So is it due to no written lock-off procedure in place, or poor quality lock-off procedure in place, or there's a lock-off procedure in place but this was ignored? I'll give you a couple of seconds. Okay, so Geoff, most people are thinking there that everyone has ignored the procedure that has been put in place.
And they would be entirely correct. Yeah. In the vast majority of accidents, you know, and I'm a health and safety professional. I can argue with the details of a lock-off instruction because that's what health and safety professionals do. But in the vast majority of fatal accidents involving machinery, there was a lock-off procedure in place. People simply didn't follow it. Now, if you're a manager or a director or someone who would be a leader of a company, then this is down to you. Yeah, you know, you need to walk the job, and you need to check when lock-off is in place, and that your employees are all very clear on the reasons for lock-off. Yeah, so there's a leadership issue here. If your employees aren't locking off and they know how to lock off, you train them adequately, and they're not locking off, you need to question yourself as to why. Consistency. You know, if you train someone in lock off and you know you think they should be doing it properly and they don't, you need to take action. You know, the end result of failures to lock off are not bruises, they're serious accidents and fatalities. You know, so you need to be consistent and you need to take action if your employees are not following lock-off. And finally from me, as I said, there is a WISH information sheet on lock-off. It's available as a free download from the WISH website, or CIWM has very kindly added it to the handouts list on this webinar. Yeah. Well, that's about it from me. I shall hand back to Kim and take questions at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Geoff. That's wonderful. We've had a couple of questions for you. We've got the first question is it okay to use ordinary padlocks for lock-off, or do they have to have a specialised lock?
As long as the padlock is of a good quality and it fits in your isolation switch, then that's fine. Yeah, there's no particular EN standard or ISO standard for lock-off padlocks. The two things I would say is sometimes I've seen people buying very large padlocks, but when you try to put it through the isolation switch, it won't fit. Yeah, so an appropriate size of padlock, but an appropriate quality. You know, if you're looking at a very small padlock with a piece of tin foil as a key, then that's not good enough. Yeah, you know, you need to have a good quality padlock and one that works, and that's about it really. Okay, and how often would you recommend that the locks and switches are tested and checked, and that you run through the procedure as you know, as like you would do a fire drill, for example? Okay, I mean, there's several things. I mean, for safety critical devices like emergency stops, interlocks, and isolation switches, for small items of machinery, you may well check them daily. That will be good practice. Certainly, you should be doing basic checks on them on a weekly basis. Check them for damage, for wear, and so on. Quite a few systems nowadays have automatic diagnostics built into their control circuits, for example, and these tend to give people a false sense of security. You know, no automatic diagnostic system, for example, can tell you that an isolation switch is broken and moving on its shaft. That's a physical damage. So that's the sort of thing you need to be checking, and on a weekly basis. Okay then, and just one more question for you as well. If people were allocated a padlock, do you have, like, as part of the procedure, where people would sign for collection of a key or anything like that, or are they just put on the board and people are given or allocated one each day? Okay, there are various ways of doing this, and it will depend on how complex your plant is, how large it is, and so on. So it is common practice, for example, for maintenance engineers to have their own personal padlock, which they will use, and that's fine. For a small recycling plant, let's say a basic salting system and a baler, then lock-off boards are probably the best way to go. The padlocks are less likely to be lost, rather than people carrying around them all the time. I mean, the principle is what works for you, and those padlocks are actually used. Okay, thank you very much, Geoff. That's all the questions for now. Perhaps we'll have some more for you later. So now we're going to hand over to John Dyne, who's Director of John Dyne Solicitors. John will discuss with us the legal duties of lock-off and sentencing for health and safety offences. John Dyne is a regulatory lawyer. He's a graduate member of CIWM and a member of the Institute of Transport Administration. He has practiced as a solicitor for over 30 years, specialising in environmental, road transport and health and safety law. John is recognised in Legal 500 as a leading individual and is described in Legal 500 as being passionate about his clients, providing excellent client care without losing objectivity. John has defended and represented many clients in many health and safety cases. John has considerable experience defending regulatory breaches in waste and road haulage sectors. So over to you then, John. Thank you very much for your time today, and I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Kim. Good morning, everybody. I hope you can all hear me. I was fascinated by Geoff's presentation, and I would commend it to anyone. What was very interesting was that Geoff identified how human factors can influence outcomes more than anything else. And I think the audience agreed with the fact that the vast majority of accidents were because the lock-off instruction was ignored. And that, very sadly, is true of many things. Certainly from a defence perspective, it's important to keep evidence of training, monitoring and supervision. And in my experience, most of the defence problems stem from a lack of evidence of the safe systems and training and supervision and monitoring that need to be in place. In other words, organisations definitely do need to document their health and safety systems and keep them up to date. In my experience, clients often will say, we had a system, but we didn't document it. We had training, but we didn't keep a register. The person who did the training has left the company and taken away the records. We have lost all records to flood, fire and break-in. And of course, the tales of woe unfold, but of course, none of this is helpful to a defence or mitigation. Why am I here presenting to you today? Well, I suppose it's because the storm clouds are gathering. HSE's 2017 campaign produced some very disappointing results, as you can see on the slide. 48% of sites had uncontrolled risks, and 373 enforcement notices were issued. Machinery, guarding and isolation were areas of concern. Jumping forwards to the latest published data set, as Geoff has already referenced this, we see there has been a considerable uptick in enforcement notices. The 2017 campaign may well have generated part of this spike in the figures, but the increase does make a compelling case for something needs to be done. And as you will find out later on in this presentation, workers are sustaining life-changing injuries or dying in the workplace because organisations are not doing what Geoff says. Analysing HSE data a little more closely, we can see that in the 5 years ended 2016-17, being struck by a moving vehicle was the most common cause of fatalities, contact with machinery coming a close second. Then looking at the latest reference period, as we've done, as we heard in Geoff's part of the presentation, we see for the first time the principal cause of fatality in the waste sector has flipped, with contact with machinery now exceeding being struck by a moving vehicle. What this tells me is that contact with machinery and moving vehicles usually has one outcome, a workplace death. And that has been my experience in all the health and safety cases I've been dealing with. My message to everyone listening is to learn from the unfortunate experiences of others. Fatalities in the waste sector are routinely covered in trade journals and in the online news press, sadly on a depressingly increasing scale. And I would commend you all to actually researching these incidents and asking yourself the $64,000 question, which is, could this workplace accident have happened to me? The health and safety executive is concerned, and rightly so. And as you can see, and you probably may be aware, they've relaunched a campaign. But the HSE data reveals that a fatal injury in the waste sector is 16 times the average rate across all industries. And I would say to you, that is a terrible indictment of the waste industry. Is it because operators in the waste sector are not complying with their legal obligations? I think HSE clearly thinks that's the case, which is why we're witnessing a second campaign, hot on the heels of the first campaign. But before I continue, I believe we've got an audience poll, so over to you, Kim.
Yes, thank you, John. We do have a question for the audience, and here it is. Were you aware of the Health and Safety Executives Health and Safety campaign before today's webinar? A yes or no? So we'll quickly go to the response now. So how many people did here have? There you go. The majority of people do already know about the Health and Safety Executives campaign, John. So that's good news.
I suppose it is good news, possibly worrying news for anyone who might not yet have had a visit. The visits will be unannounced, and they're going to catch you pretty much in flagrante. They're going to look at what your operations are, but at least the majority of the audience already knew this. I think it's been well published in the trade media. So certainly that is good news. For those of you who weren't aware, well, you're at the right place because you're hearing about it from me. So
that's it. So we do have another question as well. So have you had an unannounced visit in connection with the Health and Safety Executive's Health and Safety campaign? So that's a yes, no, or I don't know. So has your company been visited by Health and Safety Executives? No. So there you are. There's your response there, John, that nobody has received a visit yet.
Well, and may that happy situation persist. But obviously, you do need to consider what could happen if they did attend unannounced. And that could be at any point in time. Doesn't need for there to be a workplace incident or reportable incident that they need to come and investigate. They could, and they have said they will attend. So you just, well, forewarned is forearmed, as they say. I want to now look at the legal duties under the work equipment regulations. I've included Regulation 19 on the slide because it is the law, and I am a lawyer, and it's what I do. A quick word about work equipment. I'm sure my audience knows this, but work equipment is defined as any machinery, appliance, apparatus, tool, or installation for use at work. And based on my experience, and no doubt others will add to the list for me, in the waste sector, this is going to include trommels, screeners, shredders, hoppers, and conveyors. And the list will go on and on. The scope is extremely wide and pretty much covers any equipment used in the workplace. Now, Regulation 19 feeds very much into Geoff's presentation because it's aimed at making work equipment safe, where you have maintenance, you're clearing blockages. In the event of breakdown, maybe the machine is overheating or there's pressure build-up. But vitally, as part and parcel of safety on start-up following reconnection. Moving on, with risk assessment, it clearly plays a fundamental part in management of health and safety. And this slide is probably reasonably familiar to the audience. It's a short list of the prevention principles. Risk assessment isn't actually mentioned in the work equipment regulations. You can go and check after this and then tell me if I'm wrong. But the regulations nonetheless impose clear duties that, in my view, can't truly be complied with without risk assessment. The work equipment regulations have an approved code of practice and guidance, and this points to the management regulations, which require a suitable and sufficient assessment of risk, which in turn points to a hierarchy of prevention involving avoiding risks, evaluating what risks remain that can't be avoided, and combating such risks at source. So your risk assessment will need to take into account and consider all possible risks, including procedures that ensure effective isolation, which was what Geoff was talking about, any potential stored energy within the work equipment, again, what Geoff was referring to, inadvertent reconnections, such as on startup, and of course, identifying the group of workers who may be particularly at risk. And in terms of risk identification, this is a list of some of the risks that the work equipment regulations require you to address. I'm not going to go through all of them because Geoff has covered some of these points already, but I would make a couple of points. First of all, with selection of equipment, you need to assess whether the work equipment is suitable for the work it's provided to do, and that it will be used in accordance with that purpose and the manufacturer's specifications and instructions. And when you're actually buying equipment, think about the safety features that are built into the equipment as part of that procurement process. And again, with training, Geoff referred to this in some detail, so I'll restrict myself to saying, restrict workplace equipment to workers who have been trained in the use of that equipment and who are versed in the specific risks involved in operating that equipment. It needs to be clear who can operate, repair, modify, maintain, or service the equipment, and it is essential, I repeat, essential to share the risk assessments with the workers you have identified as being affected by this machine. Moving on, we'll look at the legal duty. Again, you're probably very familiar with the Health and Safety at Work Act and its all its associated legislation. Well, not necessarily all of it, because I don't think anyone could be, but the principal primary duty requires duty holders, that could be an employee, employer, I should say, to reduce risk so far as reasonably practicable. And what is reasonably practicable depends on the circumstances, which may include the degree of foreseeability of the risk, the gravity of injury if it occurs, and the implications of any suggested methods of avoiding the risk. This all falls within the concept of risk assessment. And I have mentioned HSG 253 because although this guidance is aimed principally at the oil and gas industries, the principles in the guidance are of general application for isolation. And I simply wanted also to draw to everyone's attention that it may be safer to shut down the entire process line rather than an individual component of that process line, so taking the lowest risk option to comply with the reasonably practical qualification. And I do recommend a read of HSG 253 because it does contain some very useful reference material on human factors, roles, responsibilities, training, competence, review and safe systems of work, because all these things are of general application. Now, let's look at some recent cases that unfortunately have made the headlines. Master Construction Skips Limited was a corporate manslaughter case, and this case was sentenced in November 2017. A worker was standing on top of a trommel, and as best as I can work out from what I've read, the trommel was running, and the worker fell into the trommel and got all tangled up within it. The company pleaded guilty to corporate manslaughter, and the director of that company pleaded guilty to health and safety offences. Specifically in this case, the trommel had no emergency stop, and the trommel had no guards, meaning access was permitted to dangerous parts of the machinery. I think this company has gone out of business, but you'll see the director got a suspended sentence and then 300 hours community service. It might be said this director got off lightly when one reads into the case and its background. There is another case, it's not on the slide, Geoff very kindly referred me to it, which is Gaskell's Northwest Limited. That was sentenced very, very recently, in fact on the 26th of October. In this case, an employee entered a baler to clear a blockage, and then the machine started automatically, resulting in the employee's death. There was an interlock, but it had been bypassed, and there was no lock-off on the machine before the clean down procedure began. The company was fined £700,000 and ordered to pay £100,000 in costs. That probably was a completely avoidable death. And as the prosecutor in that case said, the company was operating a patch it up and keep it running approach, and the HSE's view is we won't accept defeating of safety systems to maintain production, and we won't hesitate to take action against those who do so. Then we have another case, MSK Waste Management and Recycling. This is, well, a relatively old case. This was sentenced in 2013, and the first thing I would say is these fines seem very, very low. What happened here was that a worker lost his arm after trapping it between a roller and the belt of a moving conveyor whilst attempting to clear a blockage. Essentially, this machine was running while he was doing it. It hadn't been switched off, nor had it been locked off. Another case that has been sentenced very recently, again, is not on the slide, is Viridor, a very well-known waste recycling organisation. Viridor was fined £650,000. In that case, an employee entered a ballistic separator to clean it. The ballistic separator had been switched off, but while the employee was doing whatever he was doing, and I don't think Viridor fully understand what he was doing there in the first place, but whilst he was there, the power was turned back on in the control room, and the rest you can guess. Mid-UK Recycling Limited, this certainly in recent times is leading the pack on fines, an £880,000 fine. This case was sentenced a year ago in Nottingham Crown Court. I referred to this case in the previous health and safety seminar I did. It was a particularly horrendous incident, and putting it frankly, with the worker being drawn on the conveyor along the line through a trommel and then into an industrial waste shredder. The prosecutor, it was reputed that he could only be identified from his DNA on his toothbrush. Again, this was a company that thought their processes were rigorous. They learned a hard lesson, and they have worked extremely hard to make sure they have done as much as possible and put as much as possible in place to prevent such a tragic incident ever happening again. And this again is why I say my message to you all is learn from the experiences of others. In the long run, it's a very cheap and effective way to operate. This was the investment that Mid-UK Recycling put in following the incident. And I suppose the question to ask is, had all this been done prior to the incident, might a death have been avoided? So I'm coming close towards the end of this presentation, but suffice it to say, HSE is on the warpath, and this is going to be a long-term intervention. So if you've not had a visit, the chances are you will get one. And bear in mind, guarding and isolation is very much in the frame. If you get an unannounced visit from HSE, you may, if you're lucky, get free advice because they're broadly happy with what you've done, but you could get a contravention notice, an improvement notice, a stop notice, a fee for intervention, and also potentially you could be prosecuted, so be warned. Now, these are the issues on the slide that will be targeted by HSE. They'll want to check that dangerous parts of machinery are guarded. The HSE will be looking for evidence of pre-startup checks to ensure all guards are in place. They'll want to see that safe systems and procedures for maintenance and clean down and blockage removal are in place. HSE will also be wanting to see evidence that there are appropriate means to facilitate lock-off, which is basically everything that Geoff said. Adequacy of training for those personnel, and risk assessments are in place covering the operation of the equipment as well as non-operation aspects like maintenance and repair.
Thank you very much, John. That's some sound advice there already, so that's wonderful. We've got a question for the audience now. What level of risk do you think contact with machinery and or equipment is in your organisation? So you've got no risk, low risk, medium or significant risk. Just give you a few seconds there to make your decision. And the results are in. So we've got medium risk. Almost half the people are saying medium risk there, John.
Yes, I mean, what this is telling me is that organisations have an appreciation of the risks. I'd be slightly alarmed if there was anyone saying there was no risk at all. I'd be simply saying go back and do your risk assessment again. But I'd be saying to everyone, you have to continually risk assess because you may have installed new equipment, you may have changed your procedures, Again, learn from your own experiences, but learn from the experiences of others, because in the long run, as I've said, it's a cheaper thing to do. Another question?
Yes, we've got another poll question, John, for the audience. Do you think your organisation has conducted suitable and adequate risk assessments of its work equipment to eliminate risks? So, members of the audience, have you completed your risk assessments to eliminate risks? Yes, or yes in some cases, or not all? And here we have the answer. So we've got good. Well, we've got yes and yes in some cases. So it'd be interesting to see in what cases they haven't eliminated risks. But what do you make of that, John?
Well, what I make of that is that anyone who hasn't risk assessed all their workplace work equipment is going to have to do it. Obviously, the object of risk assessment is to identify all the hazards poised by that use of that equipment. But I'm hoping that this seminar will encourage people to go back and have another think, which then takes me on to the closing stages of my presentation, which is on sentencing. I'm going to have to be fairly brief because time is now pressing. But when we're looking at sentencing, you'll see that the offence range is going to be dependent on culpability, level of harm and turnover of the business. And when we look at large companies such as Gaskell's, Mid-UK, Recycling, Viridor, we're seeing very, very large fines. You also have to bear in mind that even if an organisation admits the offence, if it's being prosecuted, an awful lot of work will have to go into preparing a basis of plea, which becomes the basis of sentencing. I mean, no company would just walk into court and say, yeah, we did it, we're guilty. Just give us your best shot, judge. That is not how it works. So if you think safety is expensive, try an accident. And I think this is something the board room have to consider. In terms of corporate manslaughter is going to concern organisations and not individuals. In the case of individuals, there are new sentencing guidelines for manslaughter cases which came into effect very recently. The maximum prison sentence for an individual is life imprisonment for manslaughter cases, but for workplace death cases, the offence range is likely to be between 1 to 18 years, dependent on culpability. At the lowest end culpability, the starting point is 2 years custody. In corporate manslaughter cases, the offence range is £180,000 to £20 million, dependent on turnover and culpability, although that upper limit can be exceeded if the court considers it appropriate to do so. And as you will see, for corporate manslaughter, the sentencing guidelines are based on a table. And this table actually is common to health and safety offending and also environmental offending. But as you will see, there is a starting point and a range of fines. And these starting points and range of fines is based on turnover and dependent on whether there is a high or low level of culpability. So those of you who haven't had a visit, don't think it will never happen to you. The captain of the Titanic displayed a considerable lack of foresight and was supremely confident in his ship's capabilities, and look what happened to him. I leave you with this cautionary tale, and it may be worth pointing this out to anyone on your board who adopts a head in the sand approach to health and safety, and that you will be relieved to hear concludes my presentation, and I would like to thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, John. That was absolutely brilliant, and some very good points there to sort of raise awareness and just make sure that complacency is there's no place for that in health and safety. And I particularly like that quote as well, with if you think safety is expensive, try an accident. We've got a couple of questions for you as well. So what records would be needed to prove you have done everything possible to prevent injury and/or accident?
Well, in terms of operational machinery, and I suppose it's a general application, you need to have maintenance records, you need to have training records, and you need to have records of checks and inspections and monitoring. But essentially, you need to be able to demonstrate that all your risk control measures and systems are actually effective and being used. And I think we go back to what we said at the beginning of my presentation, at the end of Geoff's presentation, which is people often say, I told them to do it, but there's no evidence of what it was you told them to do. And you can guarantee that everyone will let you down just at the wrong time. So I think it's record pretty much everything, but I can't be more specific without having a specific situation to look at.
That's right, thank you. And also another question is, you mentioned HSG 253. Is there a summary of that document?
If there's, I haven't got a summary of it, but it's freely downloadable from the government website. I don't know whether there's time to upload it to this webinar, but it is, as I say, aimed at the offshore gas and oil industry. So lots of examples are going to be about closing valves and things like that, which may not be strictly relevant to the waste sector, but the principles are there, and I think it's worth the read. Because I think it just gives people a better insight into things, and then you can say, well, do we need to be doing any of these things as well? So whilst I haven't got a summary of it, it's a very readable document, frankly, and if anyone has any trouble getting hold of it, just apply to me.
Okay, thank you very much. We've got another question for the audience as well, so we'll go through that. So during this webinar, has your perception of level of risk from machinery at work increased or remained the same? Okay, so just one more time. During this webinar, has your perception of the level of risks from machinery at work increased or remained the same? I'll just give you a couple more seconds there. Okay, there we go. So it's probably increased slightly for some and remain the same for others. So that's the response. So I would just like to thank Geoff and John for their time today to give their presentation for this webinar. Geoff, have you got any additional comments to make there in light of John's presentation?
No, not really. I would stress, as John has said, 9 times out of 10 when accidents happen and prosecutions inevitably follow, it's not that things weren't in place, such as written procedures, they just weren't followed. And you know, I'm presuming most people on this webinar are in managerial or director type positions. It's down to you to make sure that things are actually being done on a ground floor level.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. So thank you again to Geoff and John for your time today. And thank you all to the audience as well for your participation and your excellent questions. And don't forget to complete the pop-up survey when the webinar has ended. Thank you very much. Goodbye. Have a good day.